Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's January 31, 2021. This is a Lewis and Clark program. We're so pleased that all of you joined us. We have at least 90 people on now. What number do you see now, Yvonne?
96. I see 96 people.
Great. Okay, so first I'm going to screen share, I think, the program flyer, which you should see on your screen. And please tell me you see it, Yvonne.
Just a moment. It's arriving.
Jay's got his finger up. So, okay.
Yeah, right. There it is.
In this program, you will hear about from our fine speakers, defensive and other actions taken by the expedition, the Lewis and Clark expedition at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, and that will relate some to Native Americans. The second speaker, Garrett, will talk about Lewis and Clark's views of natives in America's heartland, concentrating on the Midwest. The third section will be the history of the Wyandot Nation of Kansas. And the fourth will be the legacy of Pawhuska and White Plume. So, I'm Dan Sturdevant, and Yvonne Keene and I are pleased to be co-hosts for this presentation. And I think without further ado, we will start. Now I want to show you an image of first thing that I want to talk about, which is this screen share. In a moment, you should see a screen share, and this screen share shows Kaw Point, K-A-W Point. Kaw Point is, do you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is taken from the east side of the Missouri River in Kansas City, Missouri, from the edge of the downtown municipal airport. The photo looks to the west across the Missouri River, and across the Missouri River is Kaw Point there. You see the trees. Kaw Point is the confluence of the Missouri River coming from the north, which is right in front of us here, and the Kaw River coming from the west, which you see sort of on the left side coming there. The distance now is about 200 yards across this water. The Missouri River is about 200 yards wide at this point. In contrast, in 1804, Captain Clark wrote in June 1804 that the width of the river was about 500 yards, twice the current day width of the river. The expedition crossed this river on June 26, 1804, and set up camp there for 3 nights. Kaw Point in 1804 looked probably something like this 2010 image, except for the obvious. You see a lot of trees. Upon the 3 boats struggling across the river current and tying up at Kaw Point, the captains instructed the men to cut down trees at the point, and among other things, build a strong defensive barricade or redoubt, which they did. Private Whitehouse wrote on June 27 the purpose, quote, to defend against Indian attack at night. So I've got my cursor here, and right in this area here, they would have cut down all those trees and built a barricade in case Native Americans would rush them. I'm going to stop screen share now and now show you another screen, which is the redoubt. Okay, I hope you can see that now. Can you see the this image on? Yeah. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a replica, simple construct of what the redoubt didn't really look like. The redoubt would have been 6 foot tall, filled in with brushes and logs. The Kanza Indians lived west of Kaw Point, about 80 miles at the time. Since the primary concern of Lewis and Clark was military preparedness, this barricade. There had been previous events at Kaw Point for at least 10 years prior to 1804 between Native Americans and mostly French trappers. and traders. For example, the Iowa Indians came down fast on the current of the Missouri River from the north around the bend here and found some French trappers in 1795, stripping them bare, naked, and taking their furs. The French trappers finding their way back to safety in 1795 and saying they had suffered the greatest humiliations possible. Some phrase like that. So that's a perspective of the Native American, the military preparedness of the Lewis and Clark expedition at that time. Of course, the Kansa Indians were out west at the time hunting buffalo. So the barricade was there, but it was not necessary as there was no confrontation. So that's the first part of our talk. Now we'll go to Gary Garrett, who will talk, I believe, Gary, about the Lewis and Clark perceptions of Native Americans in the Midwest.
Right, that's what Dan asked me to talk about. And so I'm going to talk about something else. I went roaming through the journals. I started while they were still in Illinois, as that would be the Midwest, and took my reading up through the encounter with the Teton Sioux near Pierre, South Dakota. There were very few comments that would give an opinion that they had of the Native Americans. Jim Ronda wrote a book in the mid-'80s, which I think is the definitive thing on understanding Lewis and Clark and the Indians. And Jay Buckley's Clark book has the subtitle Indian Agent. The kinds of things that I found in the writings, I found about the Native Americans are mentioned about 40 times. They mentioned several times passing Indian villages that appeared to be abandoned or unoccupied at the time. One of the big things that they did in that trip from Illinois to Pierre, South Dakota was the meeting at what is near Fort Calhoun, Nebraska now, the Indian meeting with the Oto and the Missouri and the others, where the Indians brought gifts, including watermelon. And then the meeting at the Bad River, where with the encounter with the Teton Sioux. So for those that might not be that familiar, I suggest if you have a Lewis and Clark book to look it up, but it appeared to be efforts made by the Teton Sioux to stop the expedition from going forward. I've been to so many Lewis and Clark talks, I can't remember all of them. But I did go to one in which the speaker, contrary to prior speakers that talked about it as a political tug of war between two Teton Sioux chiefs, but was really an economic war between two factions within the Sioux. So as a non-historian, I found that interesting how an event could be interpreted differently from two different perspectives. But on the subject of what did they think about them, the thing that came to mind is Clark's, the famous quote that the Teton were described as the vilest miscreants of the savage race, which is a pretty much non-gentle statement categorizing a number of people. So I went looking in the journals for that quote, and I didn't find it. So it's sort of like God helps those that help themselves. A lot of people think that's in the Bible. It's not. So the vilest miscreants of the savage race are not in the journals. And I always think of the journals as the daily writings that the men did. So thank you, Google or Al Gore, whoever, in Googling vilest miscreants of the savage race. The first thing that came up was Jay Buckley's book, William Clark, Indian Agent. And he gives that quote, and it is from Clark's estimate of the Eastern Indians, which I guess since Clark wrote it, and he wrote it during the period of the expedition, you could say it's in the journals, but it's in a special document. It's this about 7-page long document where they listed all the Native American tribes, a couple of dozen of them. They had various categories, what they like to eat, blah, 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 blah. And that is where that quote is. So it's not in any of the daily writings, but it's in this anthropological document, would that be a name for it, in which Clark makes this comment. And this was done in the spring of '05, and the encounter with the Teton Sioux was in September of '04. So you could see he had not forgotten the unpleasant situation they had with them. And again, he described them as, these are the vilest miscreants of the savage race and must ever remain the pirates of the Missouri. And that's my report, Dan.
Oh, thanks, Jerry. I also want to introduce our next speakers.
Yes.
I'm happy to introduce
Yes.
our next speakers. Holly and Kristen Zane are sisters, and Holly Zane is an enrolled member of the Wyandot Nation of Kansas, a graduate of KU Law School, go Jayhawks, and an associate director of the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Her sister Kristen Zane is an enrolled member of the Wyandot Nation of Kansas, a retired civil engineer, and a trustee of the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. She's an active member of the Missouri-Kansas Riverbend Chapter of Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, and a frequent road tripper with other member Kathy Murphy to various Lewis and Clark gatherings. So welcome to Holly and Kristen.
Hello, friends. Wyandotte Azutute. I am Wyandotte. Wakon Resa Tata Izat Sisiye, which is my name is she who extends her paw. And Hayadut Rono Ayaturo Te. I am of the Bear Clan. My sister Kristen will also let you know what her Wyandotte name is, but I'm going to share a map of our journey. Oh, I need some access. Host disabled, current screen sharing. But Kristen, once you...
My Wyandotte name is Yoronyon Away, which means floating voice. I'm named after one of the Conley sisters who fought to save the cemetery in downtown Kansas City, Kansas. She was also known to be a witch. And I don't know if it's appropriate my family named me that way, but I try to be a good girl.
With special talents.
What you all are looking at right now is a picture of our origins. Not far from where Lewis and Clark stepped off in the Missouri, into Missouri is where the Wyandottes Reservation was in Kansas, which was in the confluence of the Kansas-Missouri rivers, which is in present Wyandotte County, Kansas. But we're originally from Ontario, Kansas. We go back, Canada. We go back 30,000 years up until the 1630s. We were called Wyandotte or Huron. This shows our journey. We're probably the most traveled tribe in North America. We're the only Iroquoian Haudenosaunee tribe in Kansas. Our language and our culture is Haudenosaunee. We're matrilineal originally. It's the women that selected the chiefs and could remove them. Men and women had different roles, but were considered equals. Men would hunt and clear the fields and maintain the longhouses. The women would cook and make the clothing and the vessels, but their major role was as farmers. That's the source of our wealth. We were called the farmers of the North. In the early 1600s, we were actually the largest indigenous group in North America, but with the disease that the Jesuits brought and with the fur wars with mainly the Senecas, we were almost annihilated. Then a group of Wyandottes, Eries, Wenros, Neutrals, and a large group of the Teantante, which are called the Petuns or the Tobacco Nation, formed the Wyandot in the Blue Hills of Ontario. And with the Seneca still wanting to commit genocide against us, we moved south. One group went up to Quebec, Canada, and our group went into Detroit. And then by the 1750s, we were in Ohio. And let me show you the tribes of Ohio. Some of you may be familiar with or not. We were in Upper Sandusky, Ohio. Unfortunately, because of the Removal Act of 1830, Everybody was removed from Ohio. All of the tribes, we were the last to be removed. We resisted it 3 different times. We were finally forcibly removed by gunpoint in 1843. Our land was assessed at $127,000, but the federal government only budgeted $20,000. So what the federal government did was come back many years later after the land had dissipated, been vandalized, and then reassessed it at $67,000. But then it wasn't until at the Civil War time that they paid us in worthless Confederate scrip for our land. This is the house that our great-great-grandfather Ebenezer O. Zane built in Ohio. There's a white family still living in the house. You can see the satellite dish. They were of substance. We were a very assimilated group. We ran the businesses. We had farms, homes, businesses. And this is what, unfortunately, we were forced to leave. I wanted to show you a map of the immigrant tribes of Kansas so you could get a better idea of when everybody came. As I said, we were kind of latecomers in the group. We were supposed to have gotten the land that the Shawnees were on in Westport, Missouri. Only about 700 of our members removed to the Kansas area. Once again, our reservation, if you look at number 9, we ended up purchasing this with our own money because the land we were promised was not given to us. Yet we ended up within a year or 2 lost 1/3 of our tribe because we ended up having to until we bought land, we camped in what became the Kansas City Stockyards, which was at wintertime and there were major floods. Because of that, the Delaware and Lenape donated 3 parcels, one of which became the Huron Park Cemetery. Now is called the Wyandot Nation Cemetery, and that's where our dead were buried. There's a lot of Kansas firsts related to our arrival in Kansas. The first Kansas territorial governor was William Walker, one of our chiefs. The first Mason Lodge. First utility in Kansas was the Wyandotte Ferry. The first free schools were Wyandotte. They are available to people of color, women. Our teacher was fluent in French and Greek and Latin and all different native languages. Also, first banker in Kansas was Hiram Northrop. Also, most of the major cities in Kansas, and we're talking about Emporia, Lawrence, Topeka, including the land on the State House, Manhattan, Kansas City, Leawood, Tecumseh, Burlington were either established or expanded based on what's called Wyandotte floats, which were little pieces of land that the federal government gave to Wyandottes as compensation for past land loss. I do want to mention the biggest issue is that we were abolitionists both in Ohio and in Kansas. In fact, the northern part of our reservation in Ohio was called Negro Town. Our Methodist minister was African American. He was a freedman. His name was John Stewart. And our interpreter named John Pointer was an escaped slave from what became West Virginia, but at that time was Virginia. And he was adopted by our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Tarhee. Some of you might know the history of the Battle of Fallen Timbers and how a lot of our land base was lost, but our great-great-great-great-grandfather was the only surviving chief of the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He was in his 70s and had his shoulder ripped off. But we, in Ohio, anybody who was an escaped slave who needed to be protected came to Ohio, to our reservation. And believe it or not, but when we moved south, a number of African Americans moved with us because of the protection that we could provide. The Fugitive Slave Act had no jurisdiction in Indian country, and it was illegal to have slaves in Indian country, although we constantly fought to make sure that those rules were preserved. A lot of the missionaries who came to Kansas, whether or not they were Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian, tended to also be slaveholders and pro-slavery. Unfortunately, because of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which reversed the 1820 Missouri Compromise, the issue of slavery became really huge in Kansas. And as part of that, the federal government started breaking up reservations, which put African Americans who were members of our tribe, who were friends, who were living on our reservation at risk. So they, by the Treaty of 1855, all of our reservation got broken up into what I consider to be European allotments, individual landholder allotments. And 12 of our Wyandottes decided to form an abolitionist town called Quindaro. Quindaro was named after Nancy Quindaro Brown. She was a member of our tribe, and Quindaro means bundles sticks. So Quindaro was started not only by Wyandottes, but suffragettes, freedmen, whites of the New England Aid Society, including the first governor of Kansas, Robinson. And two of those landowners were our great-great-grandparents that built the house that I showed you in Ohio, Rebecca Zane and Ebenezer Zane. They ran the Wyandotte House Hotel, which would have been the first structure that an escaped slave from Missouri would have encountered. And they safeguarded slaves in their basement, in their cistern of their hotel, made sure that members of the tribe got them through Indian trails to our reservations in Ohio, Michigan, and finally to freedom in Canada. He was so good at that, and he was considered such a risk as an abolitionist that they imprisoned him in Fort Leavenworth because they said abolitionists cause damage, that they're a risk to property. You had all these snatchers coming over from Missouri that would snatch freedmen and anybody who was walking around that was a person of color, and yet they targeted Wyandottes that were abolitionists. But he was also planning an attack on 6 Mile Tavern, which was where all the snatchers and the pro-slavery folks would get aid in Wyandotte County, and his house was nearby. So he had to come up with $1,000 bond. Here's this Wyandotte. It would have been in common in today's times, they're about $30,000. He had already lost and provided testimony to the US Congress that he had lost thousands of dollars in all of his stock, his horses, his cows being stolen. When we allowed people of color to vote in our elections, they came and burned 2 of our Methodist churches in Quindaro also. So he had to sell everything he owned other than the clothing on his back and his home, and had borrowed the rest of it to make the $1,000 bond. So they lost everything. I also want to mention that members of the Wyandotte, Delaware, and Sac and Fox were members of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment and other colored units in Kansas, whether or not they were African American or not. And a large number of those that died in the Battle of Blue are buried in our tribal cemetery in downtown Kansas City, now called the Wyandot Nation Cemetery. I also wanted to mention that most of us lost our allotments in Kansas. There was supposed to be a 5-year moratorium on taxation 5 years after the state became a state. Kansas became a state, which would have been 1866. Yet the minute Kansas became a state in 1861, we were not only taxed current taxation, but we were taxed back to our arrival in 1843 as a usury tax. So most of Wyandotte's, very few own any of their land. I do want to show, though, that there has been work, and last year the Quindaro Township got commemorative status. It's only one of 2 places in the United States that has commemorative status. The only other one is where Bobby Kennedy gave a historic speech the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. We also have Freedom Frontier National Heritage Site is taking the lead to get Quindaro landmark status, which is the highest status other than as a national park, so that we can commemorate both African Americans that lost their life trying to come to Quindaro, because Missouri River is an unforgiving force, whether or not you came across when it was melted or frozen, and to commemorate the families of the descendants of those slaves that did make it across, that still live in Quindaro, and the Native American influence and all the forces coming together in Quindaro to make sure that we were helping those slaves from Missouri become free. I also wanted to mention that we still exist. We still do our traditional tribal cemeteries, ceremonies. Sorry. Well, the Wyandotte Longhouse, our traditions continue. That's what it says below. And we continue to do our ceremonies. We continue to continue our language, even though it's a struggle. We continue to do our culture, and it is a sense of pride of Quindaro.
Tisame.
Tisame. Thank you so much, Tisame.
Yeah.
Thank you, Holly and Kristen. That's fascinating. I really appreciate that. Dan, do we want to stop for questions now, or do we want to move on to Deb at this point?
Let's go ahead.
All right. So our next speaker is Deb Goodrich. Let me just tell you just a bit about Deb. She is the Garvey Texas Foundation Historian in residence at the Fort Wallace Museum in Wallace, Kansas. She hosts the weekly syndicated television show Around Kansas and chairs the Santa Fe Trail 200, the bicentennial of that historic route. She is the past president of the Kansas City and Northeast Kansas Civil War Roundtables. She has appeared in and or produced numerous documentaries and has appeared on A&E's American Experience, C-SPAN, Discovery, and AHC's Gunslinger series. Among other publications, she wrote The Civil War in Kansas, 10 Years of Turmoil. She is writing a book and documentary on Vice President Charles Curtis. She lives in Oakley, Kansas. So welcome, Deb Goodrich.
Am I unmuted now? And if I could be allowed to share my screen, please. Thank you so much. Share. Okie dokie. Let's, I'd rather do a full screen there. How do I do that? Gosh. Let's see if I can. All right, there we go. Okay. Thanks for allowing me to join y'all. And I'll tell you what, following Holly and Kristen is a hard job. Holly is one of the most intelligent and one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever met in my life. And I feel like no matter what you talk about, she probably knows more and understands more. So it's what a asset she is to Freedom's Frontier. I'm so glad that she's an officer in that group and that Kristen is serving on the board. They've been friends for a long time, and just such valuable resources as well. My research, and I have to say, I'm a native Virginian. So I keep saying that one of these days I'm going to write a book about how Virginians created America. And of course, Lewis and Clark are, two of the foundation pieces, President Jefferson, those are some of the foundation pieces of that work. And I've lived in Kansas since 1992. And when I moved to Kansas, I lived in Topeka and was a non-traditional student at Washburn University. And I got to know my new state and my new town through Topeka Cemetery. And so historic Topeka Cemetery is the final resting place of Charles Curtis. And I became fascinated with his story then. And so I have been researching him some days more than others, but consistently since 1992. And of course, Vice President Curtis has gotten renewed attention with the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency. And there was so much talk about how she was the first person of color to hold that office. And then, you know, all of us who knew differently were jumping up and down. No, 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 don't forget Charlie Curtis. So my research of the Kaw Nation and of specifically White Plume and then Osage leader Pawhuska is in reference to Charles Curtis. And I will talk a little bit about why I think that's important. And one of the things, I guess this is my theme for this presentation. While Curtis is a person of Native ancestry, you know, that's just bandied about like Native ancestry is, you know, one story. And I think it's so important to remember, and I think Holly does such a great job with this, you know, these tribes are different peoples. They have different stories. They have different histories. They have different geographies. And so I think who Charlie Curtis came from is as important as, you know, the person of color. It's which people did he come from is very important and played a tremendous role in shaping who he was and his policies that we are still dealing with today. So that is, you know, where it's all connected and the relevance and how it keeps evolving. Okay, the Battle of 1,000 Slain is a oft-forgotten battle that America fought in its infancy. And this was a confederation of tribes in the Northwest Territory. This actual battle occurs in Ohio, which Holly was talking about, on November 4th of 1791. And those 1,000 slain were American soldiers and non-combatants. So this was a tremendous victory for the Confederation of Native tribes at that time. And it is still the largest defeat ever handed to the US Army by Native forces, and proportionately one of the biggest defeats the US Army has ever suffered. So it's forgotten many times because it was such a huge embarrassment. The Lake Calamity to the westward has produced great sensation here, Thomas Jefferson wrote in Philadelphia just a few weeks, or a few days rather, after the news of the Battle of 1,000 Slain, or the Battle of the Wabash, or St. Clair's defeat after that made the news. So this is a big deal. And I wanted to read, this is a fantastic book, by the way, The Victory with No Name by Colin Calloway. Fantastic book. But I just want to read, Indians fielding a multinational army, executing a carefully coordinated battle plan worked out by their chiefs and winning a pitched battle, all things Indians were not supposed to be capable of doing, routed the largest force the United States had fielded on the frontier. The disaster generated a deluge of reports, correspondence, opinions, and debate in the press. It was memorialized in poems and in song. So this was one of the reasons this was so important. 1791, we're a brand new country, and you've still got all these other powers waiting in the wings to pounce on us if things don't work out. So this is a very significant defeat for the US Army. All right, and the piece that I want to share with you, Pawhuska, the Osage warrior, lived from about 1763 to 1809. there are a lot of varying accounts that he may have lived longer. It gets confusing because there's so many Pawhuskas. He's Pawhuska the first, and then every generation, it seems, of Osage have a significant leader named Pawhuska. But I think he lived till about 1809, and he is buried somewhere in the vicinity of Fort Osage, Missouri. If you have not, I know many of you have visited Fort Osage, but if you've not, I would encourage you to go there. So Pawhuska takes part and gets his name, Pawhuska, white hair, in this battle. He is actually in the process of attacking an American officer, and he grabs his head, and the powdered wig that the officer is wearing comes off in his hand, and the officer escapes. So Pawhuska considers this to be great medicine, and he keeps that wig, and he would wear it on ceremonial occasions. Now Pawhuska, after a time, goes to Washington and meets President Thomas Jefferson. And I've got two or three, I think that it's probably 1805, 1806 that he goes to meet Jefferson. That jacket that he is wearing in this picture, this was done when he went to Washington. This is a jacket given to him by President Jefferson. So the military jacket. So he goes to meet Jefferson, and is one of those delegations that they're bringing to Washington in an effort to impress upon these tribes how big the U.S. government is, how many white people there are, and how important it is to go along with whatever plan the U.S. government has. So that's some of those early delegations. They go on forever. This whole idea of bringing, I'm researching right now several that happened in the 1870s, and it just goes on forever. You know, let's bring them and show them how big and how important we are. So it's just so funny to me that Jefferson is writing about this great defeat in 1791, which will be reversed, by the way, by the Battle of Fallen Timbers that Holly mentioned in 1794. So it was kind of a short-lived time there that they enjoyed that victory, but that Jefferson had written about that, and then he's meeting one of the participants just a few years later. So Pawhuska becomes recognized as a leader among the Osage. And the Osage, I wish I had a really good map, but I couldn't, I was going through my files to find it. The Osage at this point are controlling much of Missouri. Then we switch to Chief White Plume. White Plume is Pawhuska's son-in-law, and he is Kaw. And this portrait of him done by, the name just flew out of my head. I'll get it in a minute, but he is, his marriage to the daughter, supposedly the daughter, maybe the sister of Pawhuska, but probably his daughter, sort of cemented a relationship between the Kaw and the Osage nations. Now, he is recognized, White Plume is recognized by William Clark as a principal leader of the Kaw. The first mention of him is as a signatory on an 1815 treaty. In 1821, William Clark invites White Plume to be, again, you know, one of these delegations that's going to go to Washington to see how big and powerful we are. So he goes to Washington and meets President Monroe, who gives him that peace medal that he's wearing. They do war dances on the lawn of the White House and also on the lawn of the French minister at the time. And then they take them to visit New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. So he's feted and, you know, treated like royalty, but it's all to impress upon them how powerful the U.S. government is. All right, in 1821, another important thing happens. The Santa Fe Trail. This is the first trip that Becknell makes on the Santa Fe Trail. So where does that Santa Fe Trail go? It goes from Franklin, Missouri. They're on the Missouri River, and diagonally slashes through Kansas. And of course, much of that is Kaw land. So there are already all these white people on Kaw lands, on Kansas lands. So he comes back from Washington convinced that the only way to deal with the federal government is to just go along with them. You know, whatever deal they cut, he's really got no choice but to go along with it. So he is a signatory to the Treaty of St. Louis in 1825, which cedes 18 million acres to the United States. And it also makes it possible for people to traverse the Santa Fe Trail, for those traders to go through Kaw lands on the Santa Fe Trail. Now, one of the pieces of this deal is that there are 23 half-breed tracts, and I think they're a mile square, and those half-breed tracts go to some of White Plume's children and grandchildren. And so those half-breed tracts are on the north side of the Kansas River between present-day Topeka and Williamstown. Williamstown is just east of Lecompton on Highway 24. Perry, Lecompton, it's just east of there. In fact, there is a historical marker there on the north side of Highway 24 that talks about White Plume's village having been there, that Nathan Boone was one of the Indian agents at that spot, and talks about how the government had built White Plume a house, but he didn't like it because it had too many fleas, so he continued to live in his teepee or whatever kind of shelter he had there. So those tracts become very important. And Charles Curtis will be born on one of those half-breed tracts in Topeka. One of the half-breed tracts is where the Kaw Agency and White Plume are located. One of them will be where the Papin's Ferry is in Topeka, that's important on the Oregon Trail. So those half-breed tracts are going to be very important. Now, he got a reputation for being a personality, and he's there on, you know, the main road. And so people would stop and visit him. And in fact, George Catlin, Charles Bird King is the person who did his picture. George Catlin stops to visit him and talks about how urbane he is. He can speak some English, and he apparently is very entertaining, and people really enjoy visiting with him. And Catlin talks about how he regrets not having been able to have done his portrait. They describe him then as rather portly and affable and just a great guy. So this is the lineage of Charles Curtis, starting with white hair or Pawhuska. His daughter, Mina, marries White Plume. Their daughter, Wahisi, marries Louis Gonville. Julie Gonville, their daughter, marries Louis Papin or Papin. And then their daughter, Helen or Ellen, nobody seems to know what her real name was, married Orrin Arms, Captain Jack Curtis, and their son was Charles B. Curtis, who will become vice president. Now, when he was running for vice president or Senate or Congress, county attorney, whatever office he had, it was well known that he had native blood. Everybody knew exactly who he was. He was called Injun Charlie, I-N-J-U-N, Injun Charlie, throughout his life. His mother died when he was 3, and he was raised alternately by his grandmothers. So he actually grows up significant years of his life on the Kaw Reservation at Council Grove from the time he's 5 until he's 8. He speaks French and Kaw in addition to English. When they talked about his background in editorials, it's like they would talk about his native background, and that's why he loved horses, and that's why you know, he had all these interests, and they would attribute the more intellectual pursuits, if you will, to his white background. But I would submit to you that he comes from a long line of politicians on the native side of his family. You know, White Plume, the description of White Plume is very much like Curtis, this affable personality who gets along with everybody. And when Charles Curtis is discussed now, the chief criticism is the Curtis Act, which is, it's a really complicated story, but it's a real blow to tribal sovereignty. But what Curtis is looking for is citizenship for Native peoples, and he believes that voting rights and citizenship outweigh tribal sovereignty. He comes from a long line of that. You know, he comes from a long line of you do what you have to do to survive, to get along with the federal government. And what is the strongest force that they are dealing with? It is the United States government. Nothing is more powerful. When Charlie is 8 years old, he's living at the Kaw Reservation when the Cheyennes attack. And the Cheyenne Nation at that point, you've got Tall Bull and Roman Nose and all these legendary warriors leading this attack. And Charlie sees them. He sees that powerful nation probably at its highest point. And a few years later, where are they? They have been defeated by the federal government. So everything in his native history would contribute to his ideas on assimilation and on survival and on, if you want to achieve and succeed and survive, you better play the government's game. So I think the studying that background, and especially the path of the Kaw, that's Charlie as a young man. I love that picture. And then him at the inauguration, I think it's around the time of the inauguration, with the Native band there on the steps. So I think that that's very important in understanding who he was and many of the issues that Native nations continue to deal with today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deb. That's great. Dan, do we have questions? Let me look and see if we have any questions.
Now that concludes our program, ladies and gentlemen. Now you can ask your questions either by unmuting yourself. I suppose it would be better to chat a question.
And Dan, while people are doing that, while they're asking a question, you had made a good comment in the chat box, which was that Charlie Curtis was vice president under President Herbert Hoover. I had to look that up because I know also what the years of that were.
It would have been 1928, I guess, 1932.
He was elected in 1928, and they were inaugurated in March of 1929. Hoover and Curtis did not get along at all. The joke was during the Hoover presidency that Charlie would have to buy a ticket to a tour in the White House to get inside. I think Hoover would have done well to listen to Curtis. When Curtis was Senate Majority Leader, some people considered him the most powerful man in the nation. And he always, he was great at crossing the aisle. He was a master of compromise and getting things done from the background. And I think much of that is owing to his mixed blood ancestry and having to deal with just incredibly different backgrounds and viewpoints his whole life, and being in the middle, just being stuck in the middle, and he learns to deal with that. He's just an incredible personality.
Thank you, Deb. Let me ask Kristen and Holly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you're certainly welcome to present whatever you wish in terms of questions, but Kristen and Holly, you and I talked about, Deb maybe also in the session we had before this, about actually the Kansas City Chiefs is what we were talking about. The name of the Kansas City Chiefs And I have two questions about that, if you would, Kristen and Holly. One is, what do you, as Wyandotte, feel about the name of the Kansas City Chiefs? As you know, some of the football teams have changed their names. And the second question is about the Kansas City Chiefs Indian chop cheer, where they go like that. Talk about those two things, please.
I think from a Native perspective, you'll get a different perspective talking to different members of my tribe, just as you would talking to different members of different tribes. I don't have any problems with the name Chief. I grew up in the Chiefs Huddle Club back in the old municipal stadium, back in the old Monarch Stadium. So, but I do have problems about the issue of respect and people dressing up in garb and doing that, because to me that represents disrespect. And I think maybe if the chiefs would take an effort to learn the history of the cause, the Osages, the indigenous tribes, both and immigrant tribes such as mine, and educate the public, and just make sure that it is an honoring and not a disgracing of it. But I don't have any problems with the Chiefs. I did have problems with Redskins, and I did have problems with the imagery from the Cleveland Indians, because the imagery, to me, was very racist looking. If you took any racial group and put it into that kind of cartoon, I think most people would find it offensive. I love my Chiefs. Go Chiefs.
The other thing I would say is I have plenty of Chiefs t-shirts and whatever, but I will not wear them to a Native event because some people might be offended, and that's respecting their viewpoint.
Kristen or Holly, I have a question for you. This is Roberta. This is my first time to one of these events, and I love it. Have you, either of you, published at all your history?
We haven't, but there's two recent books that we would recommend. One is called The Other Trail of Tears, and I can't remember exactly the woman's name, but she was honored at the Kansas State House a few years back. Another one is Professor LaBelle has written
Dispersed but not destroyed.
Dispersed but not destroyed, and she talks about our history from Canada here. You know, we still would like a book, a definitive book written on even the Underground Railroad in Kansas City, because I think the history of Quindaro has gotten a little bit of play in different books, but that whole interplay between what was going on in Topeka and Lawrence and Kansas City on the Railroad and Quindaro just isn't really told.
Okay, and LaBelle, that's spelled L-A-B-E-L-L-E? Professor?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Katie LaBelle.
Katie LaBelle.
Katie LaBelle.
And thank you, Mike, for putting in the link to The Other Trail of Tears. Most people think of the Trail of Tears of just being the Cherokees, but every tribe has just, it's a different horrific story of being ripped from their homeland and removed from their land. And the trouble with the federal government is they just consider an Indian as Indian. They don't understand that sometimes they're putting century, tribes that have hated each other and fought with each other for centuries together in one. And somehow you are supposed to play good. And it just doesn't work out that way. Looks like Beverly has a question.
I do. Pawhuska, Kansas, which is west of Bartlesville, and that was named for Pawhuska #1?
I believe so. I think that that they say that their Pawhuska is named for the first Pawhuska. He may have signed one of the treaties in 1808, and there is a Pawhuska who has signed every treaty subsequent to that. So there were several of them, but I believe that the towns take their names from the first Pawhuska. That's what they say.
Thank you.
And also, Holly or Deb, I don't know who would know the answer. We have a couple of questions here. what tribe would have been in the Salina, Kansas area? Anyone know?
Well, depending on the time, again, the time, the Pawnee are prevalent there at some point, but there's so much in the 19th century, in the 18th century, 19th century, there's so much change. I guess my first pick would be the Pawnee, but Holly, what do you think?
I agree with Pawnee, and that there also may have been a little bit of Wichita Indian also kind of pushing up against that too, which is more the grass, but definitely Pawnee. And you're right, it's kind of taking a picture of time. At what time are you talking about? Because there was so much movement and wars between, you've got Siouan tribes and you've got Algonquin tribes. Looks like Beverly has another question.
I want to know what building you are in, or is that just a picture behind you?
Is that the Zane sisters?
Yes.
This is a longhouse that's up in Ontario. Earlier, we had a picture of where the landing site of where Boat Arabia would have tied up to Quindaro. But right now you're looking at the insides of a traditional longhouse, and that's our traditional dwelling. Is every a family member that descends from the oldest clan mother would have lived in the same house. And some of these were as large as 3 foot long. Talking about thousands of them in one place, incorporated in a palisade.
Thank you.
We're a large group, or we were a large group.
Where could we see one?
Well, my nephew actually built one on the grounds of the Wyandotte County Museum, but it has since fallen into disrepair and is no longer there. But you'd actually have to go to Ontario, Canada to see a house. We do our longhouse ceremonies in the open air. We use benches, but we use the same principles where the different clans are sitting. We have 12 different clans, 5 of which are turtles. The most, big turtle, spotted turtle, striped turtle. We're Bear Clan, Oyonye. So where the men sit, where the women sit, where they come into the longhouse for ceremonies. And I might say the first song and dance that is done is the men do an honor dance to women, because the first dance was performed by a sky woman who fell from the sky. And the mud eater brought up soil on the back of a turtle back when there was no land. And she took the sacred plants that she had taken down from heaven and danced and moved to the soil. So the men always do an honor dance with a turtle rattle for women at the beginning of each one of our ceremonies.
Is there a
We are on Turtle Island, and our name Wyandotte means people of the peninsula, people of Turtle Island. So you're now standing on Turtle Island right now.
Another question. Were the tribes sedentary farmers, or did they follow the buffalo, or some combination of both?
Depends on if you're talking about Kaw versus Wyandotte. We learned agricultural principles, the 3 sisters, so that we constantly replenish the soil, so we could use harvest the same crops for thousands of years at a time and not have to move. We were fairly sedentary, but we have ossuaries all over Ontario. And that's one of the things we do, is go back to Ontario and repatriate remains in the basement of the Royal Ontario Museum, most of which are children that died during the plague that the Jesuits brought, and reburying them, because our beliefs are is you get to heaven only when you're buried together.
In reference to the Kaw, they were, again, by the 19th century anyway, and I guess the late 18th century, they're primarily buffalo hunters. In fact, when William Clark notes that when they come through, the Kaw villagers are out on a buffalo hunt. So what's that, June of 04, that the Kaw are away on the buffalo hunt. So by then they're primarily depending on the buffalo, and they would regularly, up until, you know, their move to Oklahoma, really, in 1873, they would take an annual buffalo hunt out to the western part of Kansas.
I have a question for Holly and Kristen. Just curious to know, how would you describe your own views and opinions about Lewis and Clark?
I'll let you run. I can't fault for, individuals trying to know more about their world. We really didn't have as much interaction with them because we hadn't immigrated. Now their stepping point, which, between Indiana and Tennessee, correct, the landing point where they started from. We did have some caves in that area, and of course we moved around. In fact, we did a lot of trading into even Florida. One of our favorite dances is the alligator dance. You wonder why people in Canada do the alligator dance, but we do. I think exploring's fine. Finding that, I don't know if they gave enough maybe praise and recognition to Sacagawea and how she saved their tushes. Here's a woman carrying a baby on her back that, did a marvelous job of keeping individuals alive. But the discovery needed to be done. They needed to know where, of course, they could have asked a native and they could have told them where it ended and where the geography was. But to me, the age of discovery is great. The question is whether or not they gave enough honor to Sacagawea, in my opinion. And I do have a friend who is a descendant of Sacagawea.
Deb, there was a feature on CBS Sunday morning just last week on Charlie Curtis.
Right.
And I looked that up during this last week because I thought, well, it's about 50 miles from here and from where Dan and Mary Lee and I live. And I decided it'd be a nice day trip to go and see his home, which is only about 2 blocks from the Topeka Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
That home is actually up for sale right now. It's listed for $750,000. They said there were 4 fireplaces and lots of stained glass. But anyway, maybe eventually it'll be in a museum.
It is a beautiful home, and Don and Nova Cottrell saved that from demolition a few decades ago and just dedicated their lives to restoring it and keeping it as a monument to Curtis and his career. It is a beautiful home. As large as it is, it was larger when he lived there. So it was a spectacular home. And one of the other interesting facts is his next door neighbor was Arthur Capper. So it was the only state in the country where you had the 2 U.S. senators as next door neighbors. But I think that's so typical of what a small town Kansas is. We were talking about this the other day. Kansas is like a small town just spread out over a big space. There's only 3 million people in Kansas. So eventually you're going to know everybody. And Topeka is a big, small town. And Curtis knew everybody. He really did. At that time, he knew everybody in the state. He grew up in Topeka, so he knows everybody in Topeka, and then he just keeps building on that. He knows everybody. Yeah, Pauline Sharp and Jim Pepper Henry were in that CBS spot, and they did a wonderful job. Pauline is the granddaughter of Chief Lucy Eads, who was chief of the Kaw Nation when Curtis was inaugurated, and actually attended the inauguration in Washington, D.C. Really very, very interesting woman. If you ever get a chance, I don't know if Pauline has presented to your group, but she does a presentation as her grandmother that's really outstanding. It's really, really good. So yeah, I thought that CBS thing was excellent.
Probably you can find that again on YouTube, I would guess. We do have a question from Terry Hobbs, who's there in Topeka. Hi, Terry. Deb, didn't the warrior tribes start between Salina and Hayes?
Again, it depends on what time period you're talking about. But if you're talking about, you know, from the Kansas territorial period and early statehood, yeah, once you get to west of Salina, that's when you start getting into problems. And when the Cheyenne attacked the Kaw Reservation in 1868, Governor Curtis was livid because he couldn't believe they would come that far east. Mostly by that time, most of the conflicts with the settlers were in the western third of Kansas. So that had a huge impact on annuities and all kinds of things. So yeah, there for a period in the mid-19th century, it's the western third of Kansas that has most of the conflict, and or, you know, kind of the western half to the third of the state where most of the conflict is.
We have another question, but first, there was a question about repeating the name of the woman who portrays her grandmother. What was that name again?
It's Pauline Sharp, and she lives in Wichita, and she portrays her grandmother, Chief Lucy Eads, E-A-D-S. And Pauline, I'm happy to get in touch with her for you. She's does a wonderful presentation, and she was in that CBS segment that was mentioned, along with Jim Pepper Henry. And Jim Pepper Henry is vice chair of the Kaw Nation, and he is also director of the First Americans Museum that will open, I think, in Tulsa. It's in Oklahoma. I think it's in Tulsa in September of this year. So they are both really, really tremendous resources. And the interest in Curtis is really staggering. Since Kamala Harris's election, I think I've done about a dozen interviews about Charles Curtis, and one of those was with a French reporter. So the article about Charles Curtis will be coming out in the French magazine Société, I think this week. So the interest internationally is it's mind-blowing. It's really, really interesting. And I'm just thrilled that all of there's so much interest coming back to him now.
Can I also mention that Deb did a marvelous movie of Curtis several years ago too. And Deb, I don't know if that's available for folks to view or not.
It is. You can Google that. It's called Our Charlie from A Boy Forced to Choose. Our Charlie, A Boy Forced to Choose. And that was done through the cooperation of the Shawnee County, Kansas State Historical Society and the Kansas Arts Commission. And it's about 15 minutes long, and it is a good overview of his early life. So yes, thank you for mentioning that.
There's also a question about the terms Kaw and Kansa. Are they interchangeable or are they different?
They're interchangeable for all intents and purposes.
And just to let everybody know, the Kaw language is Siouan in nature. We're Iroquois. Another language group that you hear about are Algonquin, and those are like the Delaware and the Shawnee and the Dawas, the Ottawas.
There's like everything, there's nothing simple. There's tons of research on whether or not the Kansa or Kaw, if that is actually from their language or if it is Spanish or French, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth. And I think the most recent consensus is that it is a construct of a European construct of a word that the Kansa or Kaw would have used. And like many tribes, the Kaw or Kansa would have just referred to themselves as the people, or there would have been, they would not have had a word for their tribe. It would have not been like that, you know. And so when the Europeans come in, they start putting labels on, you know, these different tribal organizations. And so the name is, like I said, but they call our Kansas is accepted.
That's the same experience with us in Canada. You will see Huron and Huronia, Huron being our name and Huronia being where our land was. Huron is a French word for here being the bristles on the top of a wild boar, all meaning man. So bristly man, wild man, savage man. And it was because we wore headlock, scalp locks, mohawks. And it used to be referred to any tribe west of Quebec. Champlain and the Cartier were the first ones to call us all the tribes west of Quebec. And then finally it fell on us, like Lake Huron. But we consider it an insult, and the Wyandotte or Wyandotte, one dot is what our original pronunciation of our name, which is people of the peninsula. The other thing that's common among the Kaws and most tribes is we don't have a word for saying this is our land. We might be able to say this is the land that we live on, but the idea of owning something, including slaves, is so contrary to Native tribes traditionally.
I want to add something else real quick, if I can, a plug for the 200th anniversary of the Santa Fe Trail. And as the chair of that this year, you can go to santafetrail.org, and it's a tremendous website, and we've got all kinds of stuff. But the relationship between the Santa Fe Trail and, of course, Lewis and Clark is just so obvious, you know, with the westward expansion and the ideas. And we use the word commemoration rather than celebration of the 200th anniversary, because just like we've talked about with the Kaw Nation, celebration is not always appropriate. Had it not been for the Santa Fe Trail going through their land, they might not have been removed in 73. They probably would have been at some point, or maybe not. Maybe they could have just skirted, you know, and stayed. We still have the Delaware and the Sac and Fox, and, you know, not everybody got moved, but they were in the way. And so the Kaw, I would add this too, that the Kaw Nation has bought back some of their land near Council Grove, and some of their land has also been given back by private landowners there near Council Grove. So they have been able to come back and have some of their ceremonies on their ancestral land, which is really wonderful. But again, that's ongoing. That's part of the legacy that keeps evolving. It's not like that happened 150 years ago and we're done. No, these things are still evolving and still affecting real people today.
I represented a member of the half-breed Curtis's tribe when I was in law school, and they wanted Meningers back once Meninger closed down, because they said that they donated the land for Meningers for basically for altruistic reasons. And when it stopped being a clinic, their treaty was that it was supposed to revert back to the nation. And I know this young man was pulling out original documents out of underneath his bed at Haskell to show me, you know, the right. And it's very clear to me that they do have a right to that land, but it's being litigated, and I don't know where it is on that issue.
Couple comments from the chat. We're about to conclude maybe, but I want to note to you that if you look from Mike Sheriff, there's the YouTube link. And I'm not sure what that YouTube link shows. Is it Charles Curtis, Sheriff, if you're there? I'm sure it's something we're.
Yeah, it's a video. It's Deb's video on Charles Curtis.
Okay. So take a look at that, and if you can, make a picture of that or write that down. Another question is, why did Hoover pick Charles Curtis as his VP?
He did not. Hoover did not pick Charles Curtis. He was the last person he wanted. The Republican National Convention in 1928 was in Kansas City. So this is, of course, Charlie Curtis's home court, and he is hoping to be the #1 pick. And, you know, you've got all this backroom politics and all the votes that go on and the heated debates, and Hoover gets it. And it's through one of those kind of backroom agreements that Charlie is put on the ticket as vice president. Charlie made it very plain when reporters interviewed him. He said, I came here to be #1. And he was campaigning to be president. And then when he is selected to be vice president, they said, what do you thought? And what do you think? And he said, well, it's not what I wanted, but we'll make the best of it. And that was Charlie throughout his, whatever you got, we'll just keep going. We keep fighting. We keep playing the game. And so he made the best of it. And he died in 1936 working on Alf Landon's campaign. So Alf Landon was ready to run against FDR when Curtis had a heart attack and died in Washington.
Well, we're getting congratulations from various speakers. Thank you. You've been wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. Let me note that the Missouri Bar Association, of which I'm a member, has a new requirement on bias training. Now, lawyers have to spend 15 hours every year to learn legal stuff that's happened in the last year. A new requirement of the Missouri Bar Association is bias training. And one of the programs under bias training is deconstructing assimilation. Deconstructing assimilation. In other words, assimilation forced, well, you might want to talk about this, Kristen and Holly, or Deb. Assimilation means the Native American tribes lose their heritage.
Well, and a lot of that assimilation happened in boarding schools. There's so many generations that were forced, including our families. We were part of the first families put into Haskell, which was a boarding school. It's true in all of the states and Canada, and kids were kept from being with their families for 10 years at a time. They were punished if they spoke their language, if they practiced their religion or their culture. And all they learned were not reading, writing, arithmetic. They learned, boys would learn how to be field hands, how to take care of horses. Girls would learn to be servants in white houses. But they never learned to be parents. Their basically mentor for being parent was someone that hit them, that abused them, that told them how to make sure that there were proper folds on their bed. And you have several generations of lost cultures, and that's why you have powwows. Powwows come out of a conglomeration of natives trying to basically express themselves and come together, but most of the practices within powwows are of Siouan origin. You don't see representative, like you don't go there and see someone dressed in traditional Osage or traditional Wyandot. And there's a dichotomy between our four groups. We have one in Quebec, one in Michigan, our group in Kansas, and another one in Oklahoma. And a lot of them do powwows, traditional ceremonies with the Seneca Cayuga. In Oklahoma, we do the original Strawberry Festival, the green corn, so that those don't go away.
Maple Festival.
The Maple Festival. If you look at the turtle, there's major squares. Those represent the 9 moons, or the 13 moons, I should say, that are part of our agricultural practice. And every turtle shell has 27 keys around it. Those are the 27 days between each moon. And those are the practices that we continue. But a lot of the tribes have not regained those practices before assimilation or before boarding schools. And it's very sad. And we're still fighting to make sure our language doesn't disappear. We only have a PhD that knows our language, that got his PhD in our language, and he volunteers his time on Facebook to run language classes along with a few of our speakers that are fluent.
You know, when Charlie Curtis came back to Topeka to live in 1868, he was 8 years old. And after the Cheyennes attacked the Kaw, I don't know how it came about, but his grandmothers decided he would go back to Topeka and live. Maybe they decided it was too dangerous, or I don't know. But when he came back to Topeka, he spoke Kaw and French. And he said that the schoolboys, you know, he's got to go to school now. He's been having a good time down there, but he's got to go to school. And the white boys made fun of him. And so he decided that he would forget those languages, which breaks my heart. Breaks my heart.
What else, Ron?
Nothing ties you more to your culture than your language, because it relates to your humor, your stories, everything that makes you unique, how you think. And when you lose your language, you basically are a lost soul.
Okay, our next program, Yvonne, what would you like to say?
Our next program is with John Fisher, who was on the call today. And it's Sunday, February 21st at 4 p.m. Central. I'm going to shorten the title a lot, but it's about the boats of the expedition. A lot of detail. John's done a tremendous amount of research and work on this, and I'm really excited to see this. I've heard him talk a bit about this and how those watercraft were designed and built. And so that's Sunday, February 21st, 4 p.m. Central. We'll be sending out blasts about that as well in the coming weeks.
And our website is lewisandclark.org for the national organization. We do want you, ladies and gentlemen, to the extent you'd consider that, to join the national membership, lewisandclark.org. Then our local chapter that Yvonne and I and Gary Kimsey and many others like the Watsons belong to is the Missouri-Kansas Riverbend Chapter, and that's lewisandclarkkc.org. So are we about concluded, Yvonne?
Yes, we've had a lot of comments in the chat box, just thanking our speakers, Holly and Kristen and Deb and Jerry. Thank you all so much for all the information you shared with us. We've just had multiple thanks from our viewers today. So thank you all for your time.
Thanks.